Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Let's Combinate Drugs and Devices. I'm your host, Subhi Saadeh. And when we talk about drug delivery systems in the combination product space, the usual suspects obviously come to mind: prefilled syringes, auto injectors, on-body injectors. But there's actually a tried and true format of delivery that gets no shine, and that is ampules. I heard Eric talk about ampules in the combination product space a couple months back. Ampules offer a unique proposition because they're crazy stable. It's basically only glass, and they're contamination resistant for liquid drugs, which makes them ideal for some drug applications. I wanted to talk to Eric today about how they fit into today's evolving landscape. Have they been replaced, or is there still room for this established technology? I'm joined by Eric Suglalski from Archimedic, who has deep experience in drug delivery design. Welcome, Eric.
Hey, Subhi.
I'm joined today by Eric Suglalski, who's the founder and CTO of Archimedic, to talk about this. Welcome, Eric.
Hey, Subhi. Great to be here.
Yeah, so let's just jump right into ampules. What made you think about ampules as a potential? I started my work in combination products in generics, and it was a unique situation because the attitude was very much, we have this huge pool of drugs to pull from. We have a bunch of drugs already approved. And how do we differentiate their delivery so that it's easier for the user or adds value? Is that the reason you started focusing on ampules, or was it something else?
Let me step back to the problem that we're trying to solve here, and then I'll lead into the ampules and what we're trying to do there. If you think about the vast majority of drugs in the US and in the world are stored in vials, right? And so if you think about getting the drug from the vial into an injectable format, there's actually a lot of steps that are involved. And so let's just step through it for a second. It's not just the vial. You need a syringe, a transfer needle, and an injection needle. So there's three additional components that are needed with the vial. Now, that process of getting the drug from the vial into the syringe involves first depackaging components, assembling the transfer needle onto the syringe, injecting air, drawing the drug into the vial, swapping the transfer needle with the injection needle, priming the drug, delivering the dose. So there's this long process that's involved in getting drug from vial into syringe. And especially for situations where patients are self-administering, there's a lot of opportunity for messing it up, right? And introducing contaminants, breaching sterility, resulting in dose inaccuracy. There's a lot of problems that could occur. But still, despite all of those problems, the vast majority of drugs are stored in vials, right? Why is that the case, do you think? Why do you think so many drugs are stored in vials instead of prefilled syringes, where the usability is far superior?
You said instead of prefilled syringes?
Yeah.
My experience has been getting a prefilled syringe line set up has less capacity. There's less in-process checks. Vials are a little bit more established, and you get higher throughput from a vial line typically than you can from a syringe line. If you talk about $1 spent on a vial line versus $1 spent on a syringe line, you end up getting more throughput. So that's what I would think. Also, the sealing process is probably a little bit easier, where you can just fill it, stopper it, cap it, and you're done with it.
Yeah. I think those are all accurate. When you're getting a new pipeline drug onto the market, you're always going to start with the vial, almost always, right? Because it's a very tried and true process. There's a much broader supply chain of fillers that are filling vials than there are for prefilled syringes. You need a lot of flexibility. When you're in phase 1-2 studies, you don't know exactly what the dose regimen is going to be. You need that flexibility in terms of administration mode, overall volumes. So most drugs are going to stay in the vial. But the question then is, after a drug is approved, especially for drugs where usability is important, why are more drugs in vials not going into prefilled syringes? And I think you hit on this. It's this huge switching cost there, and time and money, right? So getting a prefilled syringe line up and running, you're going to invest. Numbers that I've been hearing and seeing are between $5 million and $50 million to go from that vial to a PFS format. So huge investment of dollars, right? And also huge amounts of time can go into that process. A lot of, and maybe I'll unpack the time and the costs a little bit more, because I think that's important for understanding Ampulous. But I think that it is that time and that cost friction that prevents a lot of pharma companies from making the switch from vial into a PFS, even though it's been widely accepted among the medical community that prefilled syringes are far better from a usability standpoint, dose accuracy standpoint. So
I think the one other thing that I will say is specific to hospital products. There is a real storage, the ways of working for the pharmacist. If you have a bunch of prefilled syringes, that can end up taking a lot more space where they would rather be able to manage their space better. The only type of product that I've worked on where it was like, no, it must be in a prefilled syringe is something like narcotic painkillers where they have them stored by dose in controlled storage systems.
Yeah, that's a great point, Subhi. When it's variable dosing requirements or a multi-dose scenario where one vial is accessed repeatedly for multiple patients, it's going to stay that way because healthcare systems, a lot of times, for reasons that you mentioned, inventory, space, they just can't have millions of different prefilled syringe SKUs. They are going to need vials. But for certain applications like emergency medicines, where time and usability is critical, for home-based administration, for oncology applications, there's certain needs where prefilled syringes just make a lot more sense. And so going back to, the time and the cost of going from vial to prefilled syringe, right? So what's involved when you get into that process? There's the CMC side of things. You have to get into manufacturing, select the components that you're going to use for the PFS. You have to identify the suppliers. You have to get that initial filling going. And then after that, you have to get into analytical testing. So you have the extractables and leachables, particulate testing, and drug stability testing at multiple time points, 1 month, 2 months, 6 months. So that process is a serialized process. Now, what happens to a lot of pharma companies get through the manufacturing CMC side, they start with analytical testing, and then all of a sudden, there's a problem with drug stability, right? Maybe the drug is interacting with some of the components. Maybe it's the rubber or the silicone or the adhesive that's being used to hold the needle in. There's all of these different interactions that could take place. So you got to go back into CMC manufacturing, maybe change materials. You have to rerun operations. You have to repeat that analytical testing process, right? And so you could go through that redo loop 1, 2, 3 times, right? And so all of a sudden, like in a perfect world, if the stars fully align, maybe you can go from a vial into a PFS in 18 months. But the reality is that redo loop is going to cost you 6 months to a year every time you go through it. And so that quickly turns into a multi-year process. And obviously, when you're doing this, you are incurring a lot of costs along the way as well. So the problem that we're trying to solve with Ampulous is that pharma companies want PFS usability for their drugs, but they're hesitant to go there because of the time and cost required on the front end. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
With Ampulous, we are solving that problem. And we're doing it, as you alluded to.
I guess before we move on, because we're going to talk about requirements and assumptions later. The assumption that pharma companies want to move to prefilled syringes, but it's the cost and time. One sort of cultural difference between pharma and medical device is like once a product is approved in pharma, it's approved. You'll have some continuous monitoring of it, but the appetite for changes, let's say, is less than, I think, medical device where it's like a continuous improvement activity. Based on your discussions with clients, have you seen, is there an appetite? It's just too hard. We want to do it. It's just too much effort.
I completely agree with your statement about pharma companies being risk averse, right? So once they have something that's proven, approved, why change it? Why fix a problem that may not really exist? But there are motivations to change. Sometimes it's competitive differentiation. If another drug is targeting the same indication and there's a usability challenge, switching to a PFS may provide the differentiation that all of a sudden allows a company to capture more share of the market, right? So there's opportunities like that. We talked a little bit about patient administered self-administration. when you're looking at complaint management, there could be some incidences that put a spotlight on these problems associated with using a vial and accessing drug in that capacity. I think there are motivations, and companies in the pharma world do experience that reservation because of the time and cost investment, but there could be a number of other reasons that they don't want to pursue the PFS route.
Sure. On you go.
Back to that problem, right? We're trying to get the PFS usability without the necessity of all of the infrastructure required with the prefilled syringe. How exactly do we do that with Ampulous? So Ampulous, the product that we're focused on right now is called the AFS, the Ampule Filled Syringe. As you were alluding to earlier, the centerpiece is storing drug inside of ampules. And so a lot of the US market has shifted away from ampules. Only about 10% of the drugs in the US are stored inside of ampules right now. Reason being is that the usability is lousy with ampules. It can result in glass particulate getting into the drug, and sometimes that's not filtered out by the filter needles that HCPs are supposed to use. It can result in operator injury. There's a lot of bad things, negative, connotations with ampules, and that's the reason that the market has shifted away. But as you pointed out, they're hermetically sealed, all glass enclosures. So very high, excellent. The hermetic seal is basically intrinsic container closure integrity. So there's no extraneous matter getting in or out. There's no air moisture that's potentially affecting the drug. Basically, drugs are very happy inside of ampules, and they have long, shelf life, really strong stability inside of ampules. Okay, so that's one piece of Ampulous. We're combining the drug and the device side in the same filling line. Okay, so you have your drug is being filled inside of the syringe, and then the plunger and rod come into place all in the same line. But what if you could decouple those things? All of a sudden, your supply chain opens up significantly. If you have companies that are just focused on building up the device and separately filling ampules, you no longer have that supply chain constriction that exists massively in the PFS world. One thing we didn't talk about is in the PFS world, the waiting line can be 1 or 2 years just to get your drug to the point where you're ready to go through that process because of all of the consolidation that's happened. With AFS, this ampule filled syringe, we are decoupling those two things, okay? And so the syringe is basically this self-contained device that has an integrated ampule breaker. It's a dual chamber syringe, so the ampule gets dropped into one of those chambers, and then through a simple operator action, you squeeze this handle, that cracks the ampule, and then by pulling upward on the plunger, you're pulling the drug through a particulate filter, through a one-way valve, and into a dispense chamber. Okay, then you're ready to prime the drug and dose. It's a simple operation, cuts those steps that we talked about from the vial, and it cuts it down drastically. It really simplifies that process. From a supply chain standpoint, you can make these things completely independently, and then you can just drop the ampule in at the last possible step, which that can be done by the factory or it could be done by the user in certain situations. Make sense with me so far?
And so you can have a situation where it's basically being used as a ampule cartridge-based syringe, where the ampule will be standalone and the holder delivery be standalone. In that case, you would want a reusable element to it.
We haven't explored that yet. I really like the idea of some type of reusability from an overall sustainability standpoint. I love that idea. I think the challenge comes in that wherever the drug is making contact is likely going to be a disposable element. We need to think through how we would do that differently. But right now, the intention is that the drug is installed in the ampule, so that's its own capsule. It's popped inside of the FS. You go through that process of cracking the ampule, drawing the drug in, and then delivering the dose. And then that would be a single-use disposable, just like a PFS is right now.
Could you maybe walk through the history of ampules? How did they come about? How were they used historically? I remember I was talking to a friend of mine about how, I got my start working in IV bags. IV bags have been around for 100 years. I was like, no, that's actually not true, because before IV bags, there was the IV glass bottles. And so I'm wondering, could you walk through the history of ampules?
What I do know is that The ampules have been around since I think the 1840s. So they've been around for a very long time, and they've really stood the test of time for packaging drugs for all of the reasons that we've talked about. They are very common in global markets, maybe not specifically the US, but statistics that I've read suggest that ampules, 40 some percent of parenteral drugs are stored in ampules globally. It's a very high throughput, cost effective way of storing drugs, and you get long shelf life, great stability out of them.
And then were there specific countries that still use them to a high degree? Is it a situation where we just have all this capacity and more developed countries don't want to use it anymore? Other countries just leverage that manufacturing capacity and fill drugs on those lines?
The majority of capacity is in Asia. That's where most of these ampule fillers are. There are ampule fillers in the US, but for reasons that we talked about, the US shifting away from ampules into more vials and PFS, the supply ampules is predominantly in Asia. That's how things are right now.
Do you find resistance from folks when you talk about ampules? I assume the standard objection is like, ooh, glass, break it. You tell me I got to break glass. What resistance have you seen from talking to pharma companies?
Yeah, there is definitely the breaking of glass that is a negative reaction, right? So you have potentially glass particulate. How are you going to resolve that? That's one thing that is top of mind for us. Getting the data that's demonstrating that we are filtering out all detectable glass particulate. So that's top of the list. Some biologics and drugs are temperature sensitive, and the sealing process of the ampules requires heat in order to close the ampule lid. How are we going to handle that? We also have some work that's ongoing around laser-based ampule closure methods. Yeah, rather than using open flame in order to close these ampules, having a more concentrated heat source that is causing the sealing without really affecting the temperature of the drug.
And then what about sterility? Is it all aseptic fill or is there terminal sterilization that happens post filling?
There are facilities that are doing terminal sterilization afterward, and there are facilities that are doing aseptic fill. It really depends on the needs of the drug.
Interesting. You talked about some of the reasons that companies don't go into pre-filled syringes, and that is human factors. I think for pharma companies that don't have the experience with it, it can be a real sore point. I've personally been part of situations where late stage programs were severely delayed because of a human factors concern or outright canceled. What have you seen in terms of human factors on ampule based technologies? Do people like them? Would they prefer to use an ampule over the multi step typical drug withdrawal process where you have a transfer needle, an injection needle, or a vial adapter? It is a lot of steps. You're not including some of the other stuff, wiping down the vial and everything that comes. IFU is long.
Yeah. Just to be clear, those same steps for accessing a drug out of a vial, if you have a standalone ampule, they exist as well. In fact, you have a filter needle in addition to the injection needle. You have to alcohol swab the break line of the snap top ampule.
Certain
And there's
things are
really
unavoidable.
there's no usability benefit to a standalone ampule over a vial. So what we're trying to do in Ampulous is really get that by integrating an ampule inside of a syringe. We are getting the usability benefits of that syringe, but we're getting the stability of the ampule, right? We're getting the excellent E&L profile, the intrinsic closure integrity, all of those things you're getting the benefit of, but we're getting the benefit of the prefilled syringe usability as well.
Where can people find you, Eric?
Yeah, a couple of ways. First of all, we talked about Ampulous, and if I can put in a plug there, I am looking to engage with companies. We're in the stage of trying to collect feedback, put together partnerships, or anyone interested in learning more or exploring a potential collaboration with Ampulous. It's ampulous.com, ampulis.com. I'm also fairly active on LinkedIn, sharing LinkedIn as a way of putting a point of view out there. And so I do that on a fairly regular basis. So people can either follow me or contact me. If people do contact me, which is great, just drop a message. So Archimedic is a contract design development organization that has a lot of experience with combination products, drug delivery devices. So that's archimedic.com. But happy to connect with people through email or LinkedIn, whatever's best.
Thanks for coming on, Eric.